Today, when we think of queer pride, we think of rainbows and bright colors, parades filling the streets, and probably a substantial amount of glitter. But LGBT pride hasn't always been pretty. Before it was a party, it was a battle, filled with death and fear, but fought with bravery and courage. And the beginning of this battle was the Stonewall Riots. The Stonewall Riots were a defining moment in queer history, marking the first time queer people decided to fight back against their oppressors and be unapologetic and proud enough of who they were to defend themselves. This sentiment began an LGBT revolution, and Pride today still pays tribute to that night in 1969. In the years leading up to the riots, attitudes surrounding queer and trans people were less than warm. The cultural belief at the time was that homosexuality was a form of psychological perversion, and due to this, many moves were made against queer people. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower began an official ousting of queer people working in the federal government, known as the Lavender Scare, declaring them security risks because their secret lives made them more susceptible to blackmail. LGBT people were forced to constantly live in fear of being outed due to things like this, because the consequences of being queer were drastic. Then, in the early hours of June 28, 1969, police raided the popular gay bar Stonewall Inn in New York City. This bar had been raided before, but this night was different. The patrons of the bar refused to cooperate with police trying to arrest them for cross-dressing or other offenses deemed unacceptable. Those that were allowed to leave the bar lingered outside of it, and gradually a crowd formed. As employees were arrested, the crowd began to grow more and more hostile, throwing coins and eventually beer bottles at police. Then, as a woman was being arrested, she yelled at the crowd to do something, and violence broke out, with patrons fighting off police and some of the crowd attempting to push over a police wagon. For the first time, queer people were struck with the inspiration to fight and to yell and to take up space. This inspiration carried through to June 28, 1970, the day of the first Pride Parade, then dubbed the Christopher Street Liberation Day March, which honored the first anniversary of the riots in a blatantly public demonstration uncharacteristic of the gay community at the time. The march began with around 1,000 people and grew exponentially as marchers encouraged bystanders and friends to join. In an article written for the New York Times, Andrew Solomon describes early marches as a radical assault on mainstream values, a means to defy the belief that homosexuality was a sin, an illness, and a crime, that gay people were subhuman. At first, Pride marches were only held in big cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, but more and more cities joined in following years, organized by a number of different LGBTQ organizations. The now instantly recognizable Rainbow Pride flag, designed by Gilbert Baker, was first flown in 1978. In a stark contrast to the 5,000 people that marched in the first parade, 5 million people attended World Pride New York in 2019. The riots had quickly become a beacon of inspiration for the gay community. According to an article by Andrew Kopkind, Stonewall became a metaphor for emergence, visibility, and pride. In the decades after the riots, more and more queer people gathered strength from each other and found the courage to become their authentic selves, inflicting real change along the way. It was a slow, painstaking process fraught with setbacks and strife, but ultimately it was, and still is, a revolution. The Stonewall Riots were about refusal to go quietly. They were about a group of people who decided that they weren't going to be pushed around anymore. They were going to stand up and shout and take up space, and they weren't going to hide their authentic selves any longer. Modern Pride shares this sentiment down to its very core. Thousands of LGBTQ people take to the streets and do just that. They celebrate and they shout and they take up entire city streets, and they refuse to sit quietly and take the abuse that is still thrown at them to this day. Even though true equality has a long road ahead of it, There's no doubt that queer people will conquer that road with the same fearlessness they showed that fateful night in 1969.